Thank you, Daniel, for this great wrap-up of what the TC is doing. So now we're moving into the complete discussion slot. So you can now fire up all your questions you have. Yeah. So Aaron tries to point a little bit to these rather broader type of discussions and comparison of tools, where he asks, given there's a lot of different programming languages, software packages, etc., used by different researchers here as presented today, is there any discussion to figure out which tool is best for a specific purpose or technical question, or essentially comparison of performance between these different tools for doing same analysis, for example? And I think this is an excellent question, pointing to exactly to something which hopefully FAIR will be one tool for to solve. What would be the point that the individual programmers and tool developers would like to raise on that, to Aaron's question?
Well, I'd just like to say that there's work, kind of a subgroup, including other people as well from the technical committee led by Anna Tugara from Sydney, on exactly this last point, comparison of performance. And here we're not talking speed performance, but in terms of accuracy of different tools. And so Anna is very much at the moment leading an investigation into that, specifically comparing different data sets, real data sets, simulated data sets where the ground truth is known, seeing how different algorithms come up with different answers, maybe exploring edge cases that might come up, dealing with, computational issues as well as more generally applicable atom probe issues, so I'm helping out on the composition quantification, for example, and whether it's necessary to use sort of full peak fitting in order to pull out composition, or do we just need to use ranging? What's the influence of local background subtraction? Does it matter how you do that? These are really important questions, and they really influence our analysis potentially quite strongly. And at the moment, we're kind of flying blind in terms of knowing where the problems are. And so I think that's what Anna's trying to address with that. I'd love if other developers wanted to chip in on what they thought was their best programming language for certain approaches. Just with my atom probe, lib atom probe hat on, I'd say I would hope lib atom probe would be portable enough that anyone could use it in any kind of analysis. I know that there's compilation, integration issues that can make it a bit of a headache, say using it with something like MATLAB. But we would love it to be, as a building block that everyone could build on, so we can avoid this problem of everyone and their dog having to write their own range reading file format, for example. But yeah, does anyone else have any comments on what they think is the best tool for the job for different analyses?
I'm happy to chuck in. So that's my very personal opinion. We should stop asking questions like, what is a particular best programming language for doing a certain job? So you use a programming language that you feel comfortable with. What I personally am also participating in this research with Anna find most impeding on getting forward here is that how can we interface with the work from others, document what other people have done? And I think we should rather ask how we can make this more explicit, and ask how can we, if we have to program this, how can we make our job easy there in the programming without sacrificing rigorousness? That would be rather the question I personally would put forward, instead of which particular programming language. Peter. Yeah,
I could not agree stronger with Markus. So the question is not really which programming language. So the history of the atomprobe toolbox for us was, I started it in Python, and I moved it to MATLAB because widgetification, so writing little widgets in Python, is suboptimal. That's why from the beginning on, it was planned to, at every point along the way, to put everything into an externally readable container. And I think we all came to the same conclusion. Markus, Dan, everyone, we all came to the same conclusion: chuck everything into HDF5 containers so that anyone at the point when they have the tool that they need, can pull out the information. And I think that that says a lot, that independently we all came to the same conclusion.
Yeah, I would say there are definitely decisions like that that get made that are very practical, like eminently practical. Like, I want to make a pop-up box and I can't do it in X, and I can do it really easily in Y, and so that's why we make these decisions. Yeah, that's definitely a key driving force.
The way that we've approached it is that essentially you have a base HDF5 file, and at every point at the analysis you can add to it, right? So for example, in the beginning, we start out with your experimental metadata and your hit data. And then you might throw in an SEM image of your sample or 10 SEM images of your sample. And then you chuck in what ions you have, you chuck in what ranges you have, then you chuck in any ROIs you've defined, and so on and so forth. And that all sits in there. And it's especially important for us because we have done the same for EBSD, for creep data, for particle preparation things. And so you can now go, or you will soon be able to go into our server and say, give me all data from aluminium where I have on the same sample where I have creep data and atom probe data, or superalloy where I have creep data and I have atom probe data and EBSD data, so that you actually can use your data in 20, 30, 40, 50 years, and you have 1,000 data sets. And this is really the purpose, and this is really the marching direction in this case.
Yeah, that's great.
Yes.
There's a sorry.
Data. There's one comment from your data.
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you wanna...
Great. Yeah, great.
Yeah.
No, just go ahead.
So there's a question about potentially a round robin of sharing data and allowing different users to treat the same data with different packages. I think speaking as the TC, I don't know whether that's something we would really want to be involved in. We would love it if the community organized that kind of engagement. I think it would be in some ways similar to what Anna was doing, but I was involved with a round robin with Emmanuel Marquis looking at clustering, and it was a really eye-opening experience. When you ask a dozen people to do the same atom probe analysis and you get basically a dozen different answers, and then you try and unpick through this really convoluted analysis chain, why were these decisions made? How even do we just simply share the kind of output data? It was tricky to even agree on those kind of simple things, let alone get to the point where we could say, all right, we actually trust the maximum separation algorithm for doing this kind of quantitative clustering analysis. So yeah, I think that kind of round robin initiative is really, really great. And I would love to see more of that happen. Especially, with certain tools. I'm thinking, composition quantification. As we've seen, there's quite a few different ways of doing that. I'd love if we had, the same sample. We could all run it. We could even have simulated data and analyze it. I think that would be great. But we're already trying to do quite a lot of the on the TC. We're fairly thinly stretched, so we would love to enable the community to do these things as much as possible. That would be my hopefully the other TC members are on board with that. We want community buy-in as much as possible.
Yeah, I just want to back up what Andy's saying there. I think the value of these efforts is incredibly immense, but I would say a lot of the people who run these round robin exercises find it quite tricky to be able to pull all that information together, and they take quite a long time to set up, sometimes several years, to be able to do things like running the same sample in a couple of different machines, or getting everyone to back. I think the issue is we're busy researchers, and the sort of round robin question is quite easy just to push down because I need to get this analysis done before the end of the day. And so over time that builds up into quite a long effort. And so I think the technical committee, before we go down the road of trying to explore round robins, this might be something we would consider in the future, is to make sure that we have interchange, because I think that's part of the problem with the round robins at the moment, is data interchange is still a challenge. So that when you have large groups of people, we actually find out we're speaking slightly different languages, and we get a little bit of confusion arising from those. So to be able to make those round robins easier, I think we need the ground levels of communication between research labs really well exercised, so that moving data backwards and forwards is not something that requires 20, 30 emails to be like, oh, actually, I'm missing this piece or that piece or whatever. It's just, here's the data, here's the server, I can just grab this. And even in some cases, we might be able to do that retrospectively. So if the data is made publicly available, it might not be that you actually have to do an explicit round robin. There are a lot of aluminium materials that are analyzed in the world. Pure aluminium, pure silicon, or near pure silicon, because these are relatively standard samples. So you could imagine that if we were all to publish our data, we could actually run these round robins retrospectively. But we need a way to be able to communicate that to one another before we can do that. And so being able to enable this is something that FAIR is really building on, and something that is tricky at the moment, but with a bit more groundwork could become easy in the future.
That's great. Arun, I think you had a question. Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, so not a question, but just a suggestion. So this is fantastic. This was probably the first time I have seen a nice collection of all the different tools and things being developed in one place. So one thing which you can think of is there will be an M&M, so microscopy and microanalysis journal special issue for APT&M. The deadline for it will be sometime in August. So basically 1 month, actually 1 month after the APT&M rescheduled date. I mean, your Excel file showing that compilation of all the different tools and developments going on is a fantastic start. But have you guys thought of writing a comprehensive review article where, I mean, the contributors for today's workshop seems like a fantastic collection where if all of you writes some detailed description of this and a very good introduction like what Dan and Andy talked about, that may be a very good review article to consider for the APT&M special issue. So that was kind of the suggestion I had. And the second thing is, I mean, even in PNNL, between me, Dan, and Danny, we have been looking at the total number of data that we have been collecting over last 10 years since the Atom Probe came here. And more recently, Jing Wang, who is actually here online, is trying to essentially do the same thing where collect this probably several thousand data sets and look through specific collection of data where we have analyzed laser energy versus stoichiometry, for example, and then trying to analyze these. So a lot of the things that were discussed today were also useful. That was basically my comment. Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of related to that. There was sorry, my son's in the background. I don't know if you can hear. There was a comment regarding whether we could have some kind of metadata database that people could use. We did look briefly into this. The main thing is we would need community buy-in. It would only work if people were happy to submit to that. But if people wanted to send in data to that database, then that would be great. And we were initially looking at what was currently available and whether or not we could set up our own, whether we were able to host our own database or piggyback on some other service. But yeah, I think that would be kind of take our analysis along to the next step.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I see there's another question from Torben Boll about hash identification and whether or not people are going to buy into this. I think this piggybacks off what Andy is saying. A lot of what we're doing here is to test the waters of how much buy-in we can really get from labs. And on my personal side, I think that ultimately we don't need to force anybody to do this. Your funders are going to do it for you. So within the UK, if you do not make your data fair, it does not count. If you have a publication and it is not fair, it essentially counts as negative points for future funding for your departments. So department down or university down, they're pushing that we have to do this. So as part of the Act on Acceptance requirements from our university is that once we get a paper published, if we want this to count towards our future funding, we have to start saying, okay, we actually did this and we made it open access and we made it available. Currently, it's only focused on papers, but for the next REF 2021, they're talking about data. So if you're not making your data available in such a way that you do not need to contact the author ahead of time, then you have not published your data, and your department will have funding removed if you don't do that. So the EU, the US in some areas, and the UK are working towards making this a requirement for researchers. So I think for senior researchers, I would agree this is probably less of an issue, but for junior researchers, you're going to start seeing this transformation slowly creeping forward. And I think that the line that the UK is using is public funds, public research. If you are a publicly funded organization, you're going to have to make your efforts public. And so what we're providing is a tool for you to be able to do compliance very trivially. So you just run this program against your database, and all of a sudden, boom, you've published your data, and it's there, and it's findable. You don't have to do any effort. It just works for you.
Yeah, so I mean, there's one of the main areas the TC is trying to tackle. Is just trying to make that process as easy as possible. In one of the key things for that is identifying and recommending a standard. So having a standard is really important, because if someone looks back on our atomprobe data in 10 years time and it's in some random file format, that's as good as useless. So it's not just file formats, but standardization of metadata, and it goes the whole way. But we want to try and put in place systems to make this as easy as possible. So we're not going to be able to do all your work for you, but we want to be able to work together and bring the unity in the community as much as possible. And that's challenging, but yeah, we'd very much, we're here having the discussion, so that's a start.
Yeah, and maybe a comment from me on that. So as long as it's a small finite number of different file definitions, I don't think it's a big problem. If I get an HDF5 file from Dan and it's slightly differently structured than mine, or from Marcus and it's slightly differently structured than mine, it takes me about 10 minutes to write a converter. What I need to be able to do is to see where things are, to open it up and see where things are and how they are structured. As long as I can do that, I don't see a problem. As long as we don't have 1,000 formats, but like if it's 5 or 6 or 7 or 10 or 12, I don't care.
So since the standards topic came up, so there is through the IFS standards efforts, there is a 35 member effort to develop terminologies to agree upon basically what is atomprobe, for example, or define it properly, and then send it to things like ISO TC 201 standardized terminology listing for different techniques and things like that. So one thing which I wanted to ask all of you is, are there specific terms that might be worth, or that you from the technical committee might be able to define? Because terminology is kind of the first starting point for developing standards for any of the analytical techniques. So have you guys thought of, I mean, if there is something specifically, any specific analytical or database terms that we use commonly in atomprobe can be defined by technical committee, that's something which we can incorporate into the overall atomprobe standards efforts and eventually take it to something like ISO.
It goes to the question of metadata definitions and eventually defining, at least more or less formally, what is the connection between different objects of the terminology. And that's something that we have discussed in the TCs, but I think it's pretty at the start. And I think that is a great motivation from you, Aaron, that we should keep up on that, because personally I can only agree. If you think about how things and terms are connected together and how this relates to workflows, then you might come up easier with an understanding and a more abstract understanding of what atomprobe is and how the individual workflows, which seemingly are all somewhat different, however, by the end of the day are quite related and nothing but specific specializations of basically, by the end of the day, very similar workflows. Yep. And I think that is a question that at least I will raise strongly in the next round in the APTC. And I would be quite happy if also there's interest in the community, because I think this is a key ingredient that can help us define file formats, because otherwise somebody makes a choice what you place there, which type of metadata. Of course, you can pass in between them fully on that page with what Peter's saying. But how can we make this even more efficient? How can we combine this? How can we couple this with the individual ideas and the workflows?
Yeah. So the people who do this for a living, in terms of metadata and FAIR and everything, they talk about subject-specific ontologies. So this is where we as AtomProbe experts can talk to someone who basically runs a database for a living and say, these are the things which are important. This is where we can inject our AtomProbe knowledge to kind of empower the data and to be able to make it, more widely usable, and so people can understand what it is, even if they're not necessarily an AtomProbe expert from the start.
And maybe let me jump in there. So as I said before, in our case, the push didn't come out of AtomProbe necessarily, but out of collaborative research centers with very, very different types of data. So I think what we really need to make sure is that we are as AtomProbe unspecific as possible. Yeah? Because there's a lot of metadata which is absolutely not AtomProbe specific. Date of experiment, person carrying out the experiment, name of the specimen, none of this is AtomProbe specific. And we need to really make sure that we're as interoperable with any other data as we can. And that the metadata definitions are as human readable as possible. So be verbose, use long names. Yeah? Nothing should be called APT. Nothing should ever be called APT. Nothing should be called FIB. Nothing should be called SEM. Okay? Because if I give that to my friend over at chemistry, they don't know what that is.
Yeah. And yeah, I'm actually seeing even in the ISO terminology definitions, there are a lot of terms that are already defined for other techniques. So like mass to charge ratio, signal to noise ratio, or background. All of these generic terms are actually intertransferable between different techniques. So I would assume there are things that are in the standard literature out there that can be generalizable. I agree with you, Peter.
Yeah. So there used to be a site hosted on NIST.gov called APT nomenclature. My link to that doesn't work anymore. Hopefully someone knows where that's moved to, but that specifically was a library of that kind of AtomProbe specific nomenclature.
That came out of the MSA AtomProbe FIG several years ago. Yeah, and it has been down for some reason. I've been bugging Fred and Eric Steele to get it back up online. But we are now trying to borrow some of the definitions there and then try to debate it in the community, which is about 36 or 40 of us from many different countries. Now, the problem is even defining AtomProbe, the term AtomProbe itself took us, I believe, like 100 emails or 200 emails back and forth. So it's taking a lot of debate, but I think the focused smaller number team in here might be able to really churn out some good definitions for maybe specific metadata terms, or even analysis-based things like ISO surface for ISO concentration or ISO composition surfaces, or proxygrams and things like that, which are, everybody uses it, but there is no standardized definition. So that might be something worth considering eventually. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you very much.
I'd like to just quickly piggyback on that. I think one of the things we're trying to do with the AtomProbe standard file format is to try and leverage these definitions that are out there. And what we're trying to do is make it so that it's not, the file format is basically versioned. And so we can reintegrate community definitions back into that standard, such that we are tightening how we define and how we use these various fields. And so software will need to evolve to be able to handle these tighter and tighter definitions through time. At the moment, we're being quite broad, just because, as you say, it is actually quite a difficult effort to get everybody to agree on certain things. And so we are being a little bit lax with some of our terminology. But I think, if once the standard is a bit more widely available, that might have food for thought that can go into these ontology definitions that can then be fed back into the standard once everyone's got an agreement on that. And that can be a rolling effort going forwards.
Yeah, so I don't want to cut the discussion short, but we have reached our time, and I'm aware people will have other meetings. People in Sydney may want to go to bed if it's 4 o'clock for you. We very much hope that these kind of discussions can go on We don't have really a good forum for doing that. There is the IFES atomprobe Facebook page. Feel free to post there. Contact your local TC representative or use the email address. We'd love to have more input for our discussion, have more people to talk to. I would just like to say thank you to all the people presenting. I think it was great to have so much content for this remote meeting, and I think it's gone very well. I hope you agree. Like I said before, we will be in touch with that list of software and contacts, the recordings, so you've got everything for your records. Yeah, if you've got more questions, we'd love to hear them, and hopefully we can get some more responses as well. And with that, I'm going to leave. I think I can leave the webinar running if anyone else wants to post in the chat or have a discussion. You're free to do that. I'm not entirely sure whether I can leave as the host and the meeting continue, but I'm going to stop the recording there. And yes, enjoy the rest of your day, morning, evening, wherever you are.